So up until now, we have been using the map, filter, and reduce methods kind of in isolation. However, we can take this one step further by chaining all these methods one after another. For example, let's say that we wanted to take all the movement deposits, then convert them from euros to dollars, and finally add them all up, so that we know exactly how much was deposited into the account in US dollars. Okay? Now, we could of course do each of these operations individually and store each result in a new variable. However, we can also do it all in one go. So let's do that. And I will start here with the filter method. So as I said, we want to take all of the deposits. So we get the movement here, and then we filter only for movements that are positive. And so only these are the deposits. And so the result of this operation here will be a new array. And so now we can call map on that array. So here again, we then get a movement. And now we can convert that movement to US dollars. So we can do that with that variable that we used before. Let's see where that is. So euro to USD. So movements times euro to USD. And so with this, we converted all of the deposits to US dollars. But now we can take this even further, and on this result, we can also call a reduce. And of course, we could also call more filters or more maps. But now let's just do a reduce here. And so basically add all of these values together. And so we already know how that works. So accumulator, and then the current movement. And we just need to return accumulator plus the current movement. So that's movement and 0. And so now let's store all of this into total deposits in US dollar. Okay, so you see that we did 3 data transformations here all in one go. So let's log it to the console to see that we actually get a result here. And yeah, we do. So this is the deposits that we did into our account in US dollars. And as I mentioned, we could of course change many other methods here as well, as long as they return new arrays. So filter returns a new array, so we could have added something else here, or the same goes for map. But reduce, for example, will return a value. So only this number in this case. And so of course here we could now not have chained a map or a filter after this. So we can only chain a method after another one if the first one returns an array. So you can imagine all of this as a sort of pipeline that processes our data. So we put data in at the beginning, which is here, and then it goes through all these steps. So in this case, these 3 steps here, and then in the end, our input data comes out processed on the other side of the pipeline. So let's just write this here, because I think this is a nice analogy, right? Now, when we chain all these methods together here, it can be a little bit hard to debug if one of the results is not what we expect. For example, if this result here would be something really weird, we wouldn't really know from which step of this pipeline it would come from, right? And to solve this, it would be good to check out the array in each of these different steps. So let's say we did a mistake here, and we wrote it like this. And so our result would come out negative, and that would be strange. So in this case, it would probably be like to know the result of this filter operation. And so we can do that by using the array parameter that we get access to in this callback function. Remember? So we have the current element, the index, and the entire array. And actually, let's duplicate this here first. Okay, and set this back to what it was. Okay. So let's now log to the console this array. And so now we need these curly braces because we will have a code block. And we need to actually return our calculation here. But anyway, we can now take a look at the whole current array that this map method here is being called on. So let's take a look. And so indeed, it is this array of the 3 negative movements. So let's log the movements here one more time. So you see that indeed we get these 3 negative movements now. And so that is the result of this filter here. And so again, if we want to see that result of only this operation, we can check out the current array in the next array method that is chained on that filter. And so in this case, it's the map. And so this is one of the great use cases of having access to this current array. Because as you see, of course, this array has to be the result of the previous operation, so of this filter. It is not this initial movements array, because that's not what we called the map method on, right? The map method was called on the result of movements.filter. And therefore, that is the value here of this array. That makes sense? Now it was of course logged here 3 times because this callback function here is called 3 times. So once for each of these 3 values. Okay, so let's put it back to what it was. And now we get the correct array. And this one is now printed 5 times because there are 5 values in the array. So let's just turn this one off here as well. And so this was just to show you that we can inspect the current array at any stage of the pipeline using the 3rd parameter of the callback function. All right, and so now that we know how this chaining works, we can go back to our application here. Let's give us some more space. And we can now calculate these statistics down here. So that's all of the deposits. So incomes here basically. Then we have the outcomes. So that's the sum of all the withdrawals. And then also an interest that the bank might pay us. And so let's go back up here to the application. And so we already have display movements, calc display balance. And now here I will create another function called calc display summary. And just as our previous function here to calculate the balance, this one also receives the movements data. And so we will also call it with the account1.movements. And once again, we will then later change this to the user that is logging into the application. Okay, so let's start by calculating the incomes. So that's this first value here. And so that's all the movements. And then we filter them for only the positive ones. And so this is now exactly what we did before. So greater than 0. And now onto this one, we simply chain another reduce. Because now we want to add all these positive numbers together. So there's no mapping involved here. It's just filtering and then adding together. Give it a save, and now we can put it here inside of this label. So this HTML element. So it's always a good idea to check out the name of it. So this one is called summary value in. So as before, I already have that here. So it's this one, and it's called label sum in. We will also then need label sum out and label sum interest. So keep these in mind for a bit later. So here we have label sum in, and then our old text content property. So in comes, and then the euro sign. And now I know how it works. At least on Mac, you can use the emoji picker. And then you just search for euro, like this. And here you go. And I'm sure there is something similar on Windows as well. Let me actually copy it and put it also here instead of this euro. And the same also here in this movement. So here where we display all the movements so that the euro sign also appears here on all these. Okay, this should now already be working. So let's give it a save. But nothing happened here. That's because I am calling the wrong function here. So this has got to be summary. So I was calling calc display balance for a second time. Now it works. So that's 5,000 euros. And you see that also now here we have the euro sign, which makes it look a little bit more like a bank application, right? And now here the same for the outgoing money. So we're going to calculate a variable called out. And now I want to leave this one here again as a challenge for you. So that's a very simple one. Just don't look at the rest of the code. And I'm sure you can do this one without any problem. So that's just movements dot filter. And so now it's basically just the opposite. So the negative movements. Okay, and then label sum out, set to out, and that did not work. I see we have an error here, and so assignment to constant variable. No, I see we are forgetting here the text content property. Maybe you saw that coming. And now it works here beautifully. Okay, now I just want to get rid of this minus sign here. We already know that the money is going out, so there's no need for the negative sign. So let's just take the absolute value here. So we did that before. So math.abs, and this is going to remove the sign. Yeah, beautiful. Now finally the interest here. And so let's say that this bank pays out an interest each time that there is a deposit to the bank account. And that interest is 1.2% of the deposited amount. Unfortunately, in the real world, it's nothing like that. But here in our fictional bank, we can do whatever rules we want, right? So as I said, the interest is paid on each deposit. So first, we need to get these deposits. And so that's this filter here. We just copy it. Okay. And so now on each of these deposits, we will receive 1.2%. So what do we do here? Well, we're going to create a new array which contains all of these interests. And then in the end, we can just add them together. And so map is the way to go here. So we take the current movement, and we could even call this here a deposit. Let's do that. We know that this has to be a deposit, and so let's call it that to make it a bit more explicit. We could do the same here, but that's not necessary. So we get 1.2%. So we multiply this by 1.2 divided by 100. So that's how you calculate percentages. And then finally, we just add it all together. So let's just take this one here, chain it here. And now each of the current elements is no longer a movement. So let me just call it here an interest, so int. All right. And now let's also just copy this one here. So label some interest. And then here, of course, it is the interest. And you see, we got 60 euros and 24 cents of interest. Great. But now let's say that the bank introduces a new rule. So now the bank only pays an interest if that interest is at least 1 euro or whatever other currency. So where do we put that in our calculation? So again, only if one interest is at least 1, only then it will be added here to this total. And so this sounds like it's got to be somewhere between this place where we actually calculate the individual interests and here where we then add them together. So let's add a new method here in the chain between the map and the reduce. And it is going to be a filter because we basically want to exclude the interests that are below 1. So this one here is an array of interests. And actually, let's take a look also at the current array here. So interests, then I, which we're not going to need, and the whole array. And so let's log to the console the whole array just to see what's happening. But anyway, what we will have to do here is to filter the result of calling these interests here for values that are at least 1. So interests greater or equal 1. And only these interests will make it into the final calculation. So into the next step here of the pipeline, which is this reduce. So you see that the interest now decreased a little bit. And that's because indeed here in this array of interests, we have one value that is below 1. So this 0.84. And therefore, it will get filtered out in this new step that we edited here to the processing. And so then the final interest that's going to be paid by the bank is only these other 4 values added together. So these 3 plus this one. But this one here has been excluded. All right, that makes sense. So anyway, this was another great part here of our Bankist application. So with this, we now also completed this part here. And hopefully you can start to really appreciate the huge advantage that working with these array methods gives us over simply working with more traditional loops. And now just to finish this lecture, let me just give you a couple of remarks about chaining. So first, we should not overuse chaining. So we should try to optimize it because chaining tons of methods one after the other can cause real performance issues if we have really huge arrays. So if we have a huge chain of methods chained one after the other, we should try to compress all the functionality that they do into as little methods as possible. For example, sometimes we create way more map methods than we actually need, where we could just do it all in just one map call. So when you chain methods like this, keep looking for opportunities of keeping up your code's performance. And second, it is a bad practice in JavaScript to chain methods that mutate the underlying original array. And an example of that is the splice method. So again, you should not chain a method like the splice or the reverse method. I mean, you can do that, and for a small application like this one, it's not a big deal and it's not going to cause problems. But in a large-scale application, it's usually always a good practice to avoid mutating arrays. And we will come back to this when we talk a little bit more about functional programming. Anyway, with that being said, there is now another coding challenge waiting for you. Welcome to coding challenge number 3. And this is going to be a quick and easy one. So all I want you to do is to rewrite the calc_average_human age function that we wrote in the previous challenge. Now the difference here is that this time you should use an arrow function and you should use chaining. Now to make this chaining work, just keep in mind the second way that I used in the last challenge to calculate the average. Then, as always, use this test data here to try out your function. And so I see you here in a minute or 5 minutes maybe once you're done. All right, so let's grab the code here from the previous one. So there's no need to just rewrite everything. So let's get rid of all the comments here, all the console.logs. And so let's save it here and then rewrite it as an arrow function. So it still takes in the ages. And now what it returns is simply the ages, then dot this map. So calculating the human ages. Okay. And then on the result of that, we filter for only the adult dogs. So when the age is greater than 18. So this is what we have for now. Let's call this one here 2. Okay. And so for now, this is the 2 arrays that we have, one for each function call. But now let's then also calculate the average. And so for that, all we need to do is to chain this method of calculating the average that I showed you in the last lecture, or actually in the last challenge. So pasting that here. And so now we get the exact same results as before. And that's actually already it. Now, what's really important to notice here is that this is actually really the only way of calculating the average now. So basically dividing the age by the length of the current array immediately here in each of the iteration. So remember that in the last challenge, I first simply added all the values together, and then afterwards I divided it by the length of the array. So in this case, by the length of the adults array. However, that would not work in this case, because there would be no way of knowing the length of the adults array. So of this result here, right? Because we haven't stored it anyway, and so we couldn't do like this, like adults.length, right? This wouldn't be possible because adults here does not exist anywhere. And therefore, we need to take that length from this input here. So from this fourth parameter, which gives us access to the array on which the method is called. And that's the reason why I showed you this way here in the last lecture. Because, yeah, again, this is the only way in which we can now calculate this average. Unless we wanted to do it in 2 steps. But my instruction here was to really do it all with chaining. And so this is the way to go then. All right. So make sure you understand really why and also how this one here works. And then let's already move on to our next method, which is going to be the find method. So another really cool one. So I can't wait to see you there. After the very important map, filter, and reduce methods, we still have some more methods to learn, which are also super important and used all the time. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about the find method. So as the name says, we can use the find method to retrieve one element of an array based on a condition. So let's again use our movements. And so find, and just like the other methods that we've been talking about, the find method also accepts a condition. And just like the other array methods we've been talking about, the find method also accepts a callback function, which will then be called as the method loops over the array. All right, so find is basically just another method that loops over the array, but then it does something different. And in this case, what the find method does is to retrieve an element of the array. So as always, the current element of the iteration is the movement, and then here we specify a condition. So let's say movement less than 0. So basically, this is here a withdrawal, right? So a negative movement. So you see that just like the filter method, the find method also needs a callback function that returns a Boolean. So the result of this is of course either true or false. Now, unlike the filter method, the find method will actually not return a new array, but it will only return the first element in the array that satisfies this condition. So basically, in other words, the first element in the array for which this operation here becomes true. And so basically this here will return the first withdrawal. So first withdrawal is this. So let's log the movements again to the console. And then let's also log the first withdrawal. And so indeed, minus 400 here is the very first value that appears in the array that is negative. Okay? So as you see, the find method is a bit similar to the filter method, but there are two fundamental differences. First, filter returns all the elements that match the condition, while the find method only returns the first one. And second, and even more important, the filter method returns a new array, while find only returns the element itself and not an array. Okay? So make sure that you understand this fundamental difference. Now, this example here is not really exciting, and so let's now take it to the next level and start actually working with our array of objects. So that's this accounts array, remember? So this array which contains the 4 objects where each of them is one account. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a pretty common data structure in JavaScript. And so let's now work with this together with the find method. Because in this context, the find method actually becomes really useful. So that's because using find, we can now basically find an object in the array based on some property of that object. And so that's really cool. So let me show it to you. So let's create a variable called account, and it's going to be accounts. So all the accounts dot find, and then our callback. And so as we loop over accounts, each of the current elements is one account. Okay. And so now let's say we want to select one of the accounts by the name. Now this disappeared here, so let's bring it back. Okay. So let's say we want to get the account where the owner is Jessica Davis, right? So we can simply do account.owner equals Jessica Davis. So let's see. Just the account. And indeed, we get now only this object. And this is really, really powerful of arrays and objects. So where one array contains multiple objects, which all have a similar structure. So all of them here have an owner, have a movement, a pin, a username, and so on and so forth. So using the find method, we can then search this array basically to find an object that matches a certain property that we already know. So in this case, that property that we know is the name. All right. And so we simply compare Jessica Davis here with the account owner. And whenever this condition here is true, well, then that object is returned. So usually the goal of the find method is to just find exactly one element. And therefore, we usually set up a condition where only one element can satisfy that condition. And so that's why we used the equal operator here. Okay, so if the owner names are unique, then this equal operator here will only ever match one account with this name here. All right, and we will actually use this in the next couple of lectures to implement the login feature and also some other features. Now, I'm going to leave it to you here as a challenge to implement this functionality using the for off loop just like we have been doing it with some of the other methods, like map and filter. So we have also been implementing these using the for-off loop just to see the difference. But now I'm not going to do that, but I'm leaving it here as an idea for you to do that. Now anyway, let's go now to the next video and actually start to implement the login functionality. Let's now finally implement the login feature of our application. And this is going to be a lot of work, so let's get started right away. And to start, let's take a look at our demo application. So in this case here, in the beginning, we cannot see anything. So there's no logged in user. And then we can input a username. And so this is the kind of username that we computed before, remember, and then the PIN. And if that is correct, so if the PIN corresponding to this account is correct, then we get logged in. And that's going to happen whether we click on this button here or hit the enter key. And so then all of this appears. So all the values here are calculated. And yeah, so that's the main thing that we need to do in this lecture. And then of course, if someone else logs in, then their values are going to be displayed. And so let's take a look at the HTML here of this form. So indeed, here we have a form element, and this form has a button. And so it's onto this login button that we will attach the add event listener method. Then, as for the inputs, the username is going to come from this one with this class, login user -- input, and the PIN is going to come from this one. And as always, I already have all of this here selected. So this is the button here. And then we have input login username and input login PIN. Okay, so let's now create these event handlers. So event handlers right here. So button login, add event listener for the click, and then as always, our callback function. And here, let's just log to the console login. Okay. And now, did you see what happened here? Take a close look down here what happens as we click. So for a flash there, you saw the login and then the page reloaded, right? And that's because this is a button in a form element. And so in HTML, the default behavior when we click the submit button is for the page to reload. So we need to stop that from happening. And for that, we need to actually give this function here the event parameter. And let's just call it event. And you already know how this callback function gets access to this event object, remember? And so on that event, we can call a method called prevent default, like this. And so as the name says, this will then prevent this form from submitting. So prevent form from submitting. So let's do that again. And now we fix that problem and we can see login. Okay. Now another thing that's great about forms is that whenever we have one of these fields here inputted, and when we then hit enter like this, then that will actually automatically trigger a click event on this button. Okay. So once again, hitting enter in this field or in this field is exactly the same as the user clicking right here. So both of these things will trigger a click event. So you see, as I hit enter, we get more and more click events. So that's why we get then login logged to the console. But now let's do the actual work. So to log the user actually in, we need to find the account from the accounts array with the username that the user inputted. And so that's where our find method comes into play again. So we can do accounts.find. And then this is actually the same that we did in the last video. So account.owner should be the same as, so 3 equals actually. And so remember, we have this value at input login username. Okay, so that is this element here. And then from there, we need to take the value property. Remember that? So we did this here, I think in the guess my number game, where we also read the value out of an input field. And so here, this is the same. And so now let's actually save this into a variable. Now this variable needs to be defined outside of this function. Okay, and that's because we will need this information about the current account also later in other functions. So it's a good thing to have this big important information outside of this function so that we can then remember it for other actions in our application. For example, when we transfer money here, then we need to know from which account that money should actually go. And so for that, we need the current account. So current account, and here we just define it, and that's why we need a let. And so then here we assign it this value. So current account. Okay, so let's check that. So JS, and we get undefined. So there was some problem here. And the problem is, as I see right away, is that we are looking for the owner, but we need to look for the username. So the owner is the whole name, but the username property is these properties that we created earlier. So here in this function, remember? So we need to compare this value here that the user inputs, of course, to that username. So try that again. And now here we get the object which has exactly this username. All right. And so it is here my object, basically. All right. So we got the user that is trying to log in. And now all we need to do in order to actually log the user in is to check if the PIN is correct. So PIN here is like a password, but something that we usually use like in an ATM. And so I decided to just go with that here, because I think this also looks a little bit like an ATM machine here. So let's then do that test. So if current account dot PIN is equal to input login PIN. Okay, so that's the variable that holds the selection of selecting this element. And then again, we need to take the value. And finally, we also need to convert this to a number, because as I mentioned earlier, this value will always be a string. All right. And so here, before we do anything, let's just log in again here to the console. Okay, so JS, and we got logged in. But if we only input JS, then we simply get the object itself, but without being logged in because the PIN is correct. And now let's try just some other user to see what happens here. And we get an error. So that error is cannot read property PIN of undefined. And so the reason for this is that this object here is now undefined, right? Because no account could be found for this username. And so the find method, so this one here, will return undefined if no element matches this condition. So that's something that we haven't seen before, and so that's why I'm showing this to you. But anyway, how should we solve this? Well, the first thing that might come into mind is to simply check if the current account exists, like this. Okay, so this would fix the problem, but we can do better because we already learned about something called optional chaining. Remember? So we can do this, and then this PIN property will only be read in case that the current account here actually exists. Remember that? And so this is a lot easier and a lot more elegant. So let's try that. And so now nothing happened. So no error. All we get here is the undefined because, yeah, this account does not exist. But that's, of course, not a problem. Okay, but now in case that the account does exist and that the PIN is correct, what should we do? Well, let's take a look at our flowchart here. So this is the part we already checked. So if we have the correct credentials, right? And so if yes, then we should display the UI and the welcome message. So let's write that here in our script. Put that here. And so I like to kind of plan out what I'm doing here using comments. So display UI and a welcome message. Next up, we should display and calculate the balance, then the same with the summary, and the same with the movements. Okay, this part here we are leaving for the next section about the timer. Okay, so display balance, summary, and movements. So display movements, display balance, display summary. And let's start with the message here. So that is this element here. So let me inspect that. So it's this paragraph here called welcome. And so as always, I already have that selected. So it's a label, so probably it's called label welcome. Label, indeed, here it is, label welcome dot text content, as always. And then here we are going to write welcome back and then the first name of the person. Welcome back. And then the owner of the current account. So that's current account dot owner and then only the first word. So how do we do that? Well, we use our good friend split. And we split it with the space. So as I said, we use this one all the time. And then from the resulting array, we simply take the first element like this. Okay, so this displays the message. And now about displaying the UI, remember how in the beginning we set the opacity here from 0, basically back to 100, which is the default. So usually the opacity here is at 0. And so now when we log the user in, we actually set this opacity here to 100. So as we save this now, it will all disappear. And so now what we will do is the container app, I think. Yes. So container app is the element that we selected previously, which has this app class. Okay. So this element, we will manipulate the style and in particular the opacity style. Now remember how I said in another project that it's also good to use classes for this. Okay. But in this case, it's really just one style. So it's not a big work to just do it like this. So let's test this one out for now. So JS and my pin. And indeed, we get our message here. And also we get everything here now back to visible. And Jessica Davis now, which has pin 2222. And so now we also get Jessica. Now, as you see, these balances and these movements here, they are all still hard-coded from what we had back here. So here we called calc display summary and also the balance and the movements. But now we want to do that not here, but actually inside of the login function. So let's remove all of this. Again, because we do not want to call these functions right in the beginning when our script is loaded. We only want to calculate and display the balance and the movements and the summary as soon as we actually get the data that we want to display. Right? That makes sense. So let's remove all of that. and actually do it here. So display movements, and then it is the current account dot movements, right? And that's because this method here, or actually this function here, it expects a movement argument. And as we hover this function name, VS Code is so smart that it actually shows it to us here. And so from there, we can immediately see what we need to pass into the function. So that's really handy. Then the same with the balance. So display, or calc display balance actually. And so once again, let's just hover this here to make sure what we need. And it is the movements. So that data is stored in the current account dot movements. And finally, also the summary. So calc display summary. And once again, we will need the movements. So that data is in current account dot movements. All right. Now we will have to come back to this function here by the end of this lecture. But for now, let's leave it like this. And let's log in again, first with Jonas. And so this is the data that we are already used to seeing, this balance value and this movements here, because we have always been printing these values here using that account. But now, as we log in as Jessica Davis, you will see that these values here will all change accordingly. So let's see. And yes. So that's great. Now we are getting all of these values, so this data here dynamically really from the account object itself. So we have all her movements, we calculated all of these statistics or summaries, and of course also the balance is now really about this account itself. And we have more. Let's try Stephen here. So Stephen Thomas Williams with pin 3333. And this kind of messed up our UI here because of this calculation. So Stephen only has a balance of 10 euros. And now finally we can try Sarah Smith. And so once again, we see all her different movements here. And yeah, this is great. So this now really works depending on the user's data. So let's go back here. So what I want to do next is to, as we log in, also get rid of this data here. Okay, so basically emptying these two fields. And also as we log in like this, I didn't want this field here to lose its focus. So let's do that before this. So clear the input fields. And so we already know that the fields are input login username, which we want to set to the empty string, and then also input login pin. And we can do it like this. Login pin, also set it to equal, because the assignment operator works from right to left. So it will start here assigning equal to this field here. And then this here will become the empty string. And so then empty string will also be assigned to this one. We are just missing the dot value here. Otherwise, we would set the entire element to the empty string. All right. So JS 1111. Okay. And now this happens, what I mentioned before, is that this field here still has this focus. So we can see the cursor there blinking. And so that's a bit ugly. And so on that field, so input login pin, we can use this blur function or method. So just call blur. And so that will make it so that this field loses its focus. So you see, now it looks great. And now just to finish, we also need to come back to this function here, just as I mentioned earlier. So calc display summary, and let's go there. So this one here. And as you see, we calculated the interest using this 1.2 rate, right? So right now, for all of the accounts, the interest rate is now calculated using this 1.2 interest rate. However, as we take a look at the accounts, each of them actually has a different interest rate. So this one has 1.2, but this one has 1.5. And this one has less, so it gets a less interest. And so now, of course, we also want to dynamically use this interest rate depending on the current user. Right? That makes sense. And so we have to modify this function here a little bit. And so in order to get access to that data, so to that interest rate, we now need more than just the movements. Instead of the movements, we want now the entire account, because then we can take the movements from the account and also the interest rate. All right? So again, we will now change this function and pass in the entire account and not just the movements array. And so then from there, we will be able to take the movements that we need to calculate these three statistics here, and then also the interest rate that we have here. So account, let's just call it, or let's just call ACC one more time. So here, now we need to take the movements from that account, the same here and here. All right. And now here, instead of this 1.2 fixed rate, we take ACC dot the interest rate that's in there. All right. So let's just see if everything still works. And let's see it with Steven. So that was STW and 3333. And you see that now our UI is no longer messed up. But of course we forgot to call this function here correctly. That's probably why we got this error. Yeah, right. So down here we are still calling this function only with the movements array. So we need to instead pass in the entire account, because as you see, now we do need the account here. So try that again. TW. And so now we get the correct interest. And maybe you remember that before it was different. It was this crazy long number with a lot of zeros, which messed up our user interface here. So this means that it is now being calculated differently for each of the user according to their own specific interest rate. Great. And with this, we implemented all of the tasks that we had in our flowchart for this functionality. And in practice, what this means is that for the first time, we made all of this data that we see here in our application dynamic. So depending on which user is actually logging in. So let's see that change again. Let's try a wrong pin here. And so now nothing happens. And of course, we could now hide the user interface and display an error message, but I want to keep it simple here. So this is just a simple learning application, so we don't need to mess with all of that. What matters is only the correct version for now. And so with the correct pin, now as you saw, the data changed here back to this Jonas account. Awesome, that's great. So that's really great progress. Congratulations for making it this far in this section. I know there's a lot to learn and a lot to take in, but I hope that this lecture too was clear to you how everything worked here. And just to recap, clearly the most important part here is the usage of this find method here and knowing that this is the correct method for the job. So maybe analyze this line here a little bit and then see exactly what happens here. Also this nice usage of the optional chaining. And then we are ready to implement our next feature, which is going to be transferring money from one of our users to another. In this video, we're going to implement our next feature, which is to transfer money from one user to another. And this is how transfers work. So here we input the username of the user to which we want to transfer, and then here the amount. Okay, and so now we need to attach an event handler to this button here, and then we're going to take a look at our flowchart to see what we have to do. Okay, but let's start to take a look here at this element. So it is the button form, and then we will take our values from form input amount and form input to. So that's input transfer to and input transfer amount. And the button is button transfer. So as always, I already selected them here beforehand. So let's use button transfer dot add event listener click and then our function, and we will actually need our event here again, because just like before we need to do event dot prevent default, because this one is also a form, and so without this if we clicked here, then that would reload the page. So this here is pretty common to do when we're working with forms. So preventing the default behavior. Okay. All right. So let's create some data here based on the input data, and starting with the amount. So the amount to transfer is input transfer amount dot value. And then we need to convert it once again to a value, or to a number, actually. Okay. Oh, and now as I reload here, of course, we lose all this data. So this current data that we need. So now we will have to start to log in always here. And we could find a way around this, but yeah, let's just keep logging in whenever we have to check our code. So anyway, we have the amount, and then we also want to figure out the account to which we want to transfer. So const receiver account. And now the value is, of course, in input transfer to dot value. So that is the string that's going to be right here. So for example, if we want to transfer to Jessica Davis, that's going to be JD, right? However, that value alone, so that username alone, is not that helpful. It is only helpful when we use it to then actually find the account object to which we want to transfer. All right. And so for that, we once again use the find method. So that's accounts. So that's the array holding all the accounts. And then we have the current account, and we want to find account where the username is equal to this value that we put in here. All right. So to recap here, we are now looking for the account which has this value here. So that's going to be the username value that we input into that form, so to which we want to transfer. And so here we are looking for the account with the username which is equal to that inputted username. And then we select that from the account once more using the find method here. Okay, so we have this data. Let's just check if it is correct here by logging it all to the console. So also the receiver account. So this should be a comma. So I'm logging in as JS with this pin. And now let's say I transfer to Jessica Davis. That's JD, 100 euros. And now in the console, we indeed get 100 and the account with the username that I just inputted there. Great. So let's see what we have to do now. So what we will do is to add a negative movement to the current user and add a positive movement to the recipient. And that makes sense, right? So if I transfer 100 to someone, I should lose that 100 and the other person should receive that 100. Otherwise, we would just be creating new money, right? So we do that, and then we update the UI again. So we show again the movements, summary, and balance, because all of that will be affected by this transfer. Now, what's kind of missing here in this flowchart is that we also actually first need to check some stuff. So we need to check if the amount here is actually a positive number, and we also need to check if the current user, so Jonas right now, actually has enough money. So I should not be able to transfer 5,000 if I only have like 3,000 and something. Okay, so let's implement that check first. So as I just said, the amount needs to be greater than 0. Otherwise, we could do a negative transfer and basically transfer money to ourselves. So this needs to happen. And also, the balance of the current account needs to be greater or equal the amount that we're trying to transfer. Now, this balance value is actually not stored anywhere, right? So in the place where we calculate this balance, so that's right here, so calc display balance, all we do is to calculate it and then display it immediately on the user interface. But we do not save it anywhere. So let's actually change that. So besides only displaying it on the user interface, we also want to save it in the account. Now, how do we get access to that account? Well, we will do the same as we did previously with this function here, where now instead of the movements, we pass in the entire account. And so then we will be able to read the movements here from that account. And also we will be able to then create a new property on that account with the balance. Okay? So I hope that makes sense. So we are changing it from movements. And so now we will be calling it with an entire account object. So here we need to do account.movements. And before we move on any further, let's call this correctly. So calc display balance should now only be called with the entire account object and not only with the movements array. Okay, so here it is. So now we take the movements from the account object and then we can add that. So we can say account.balance equals balance. And in fact, we can make this even better. We can store this value here immediately in account.balance. So let's do that. Account.balance here. And then we get that property here from account.balance as well. Great. And remember why all of this works. And we have some error here, but that doesn't matter. It's something unrelated. Now, anyway, let's remember why all of this works. So why we can set this property here on this account object that we receive, and it will then set that right here on these objects that we have here. Well, and the reason is that, once again, all of these different references do actually point to the exact same objects in the memory heap. Okay, so when we access this account1 object here, so down here in the login function, so right here, where we create this current account variable, this is of course not really a copy of the object itself. So just as we learned before, this is simply another variable which points to the same, so to the original object in the memory heap. Okay, so this current account object again is exactly one of these objects that we have right here. So one of the objects of the account array, right? They are the exact same object, they simply have different name. Here it is called account1, but then down here it might be called the current account. Okay, and then we use that current account to pass it into this calc display balance function. And so then inside of that function, it will have even another name. So here it will be called ACC, but it's still the same object, okay? It's still pointing to the same place in the heap, so in the memory. All right, and therefore setting the balance property here on ACC is exactly the same as setting it up there where we first defined the objects, okay? And I will show you that in practice in a second. But now let's go here. And so this is where this error comes from, because we don't have any code block, and also because there is no second operand here. So anyway, let's go back to this condition here. So we already defined that the transfer can only happen if the amount is greater than 0. And now the second part is that the current user needs to have enough money to do this transfer. And so that means current account dot balance, which is the property that we just defined. All right. So we calculated the balance, and that needs to be at least equal to the amount that we're trying to transfer. Okay. Also, we should not be able to transfer money to our own account. So let's add that condition as well. So what we're trying to say is that the receiver account dot username must be equal from the current account dot username. All right. And here we have one equal too much. All right. And actually, we should also check if this receiver account actually exists. So if it doesn't exist, of course, it makes no sense to transfer money there. So we could add that here, like simply testing this. But instead, since we're already trying to read a property from that object here, we can use, once again, optional chaining, like this. And so then, if this object here doesn't exist, then immediately this here will become undefined, and the whole AND operation will fail. And so in this case, we don't need that. Let me just comment it out. And so now this should work. And so let's just log something to the console. So transfer valid. And now I will check all of these conditions here. So let's log in. And now I want to transfer again to Jessica Davis, and I will try to transfer 0. So we get 0, but we do not get transfer valid. So that means we didn't enter this if block here. Now let's try to transfer more than I have. And so this is also not valid, but now 500. And so all of these should now be true. So you see transfer valid. If I try something else, then again, nothing should happen. Oh, and actually it does happen. So indeed, the receiver account is undefined. And so this here will now be undefined. Oh, but I see what's happening. Because all that we are asking here is for this here to be different than the current account dot username. And so JS is of course different than undefined, and therefore this here is still true. And so in fact, we need to do this as well. So let's try this again. And so you see, of course, bugs like this can happen all the time. And so we find them, we fix them, and we move on. And of course, now we test with some wrong username there, and now nothing happens. Okay, so now the transfer is not valid. Now I'm also trying to transfer to myself, and so this is also not valid. But finally, to Jessica David, it will be valid. Okay, and so now here we can finally do what we intended to do all along. So these steps that we have here. So let's do that. So the current account dot movements. So we will add one new movement. And so we're pushing here the amount, but negative. So the negative amount. And now on the receiver account, we will add a positive movement. Okay, and that's actually already it. That's the most important part of doing the transfer. So doing the transfer, and then we also want to update the user interface. So we could now copy this code here and paste it there as well, but that's not a good practice, as you already know. And so I will now refactor this code here all into one function. So let me grab this here, and this function will be called update UI, and it will also receive, of course, the current account. So let me write now the function here, update UI equals function, and I'm going to leave it empty for now. And so indeed here I need the current account now. Okay, so otherwise I could not call these three functions then using the account. But here I can call them whatever I want again. So let me just call them account. All right. So we refactored that functionality into its own function. And so now we can call this function anywhere that we want in our code, and it will then always perform these three tasks. Okay. So here I already called it update UI. Let me just write it here also as a comment. And now all I have to do is to paste it here as well. Great. So that should be working already. So let's transfer to Jessica Davis 500. And so now I should see one negative movement here, and this should also decrease by 500. And indeed, it did. So let's check now here the accounts variable, just to see if we actually get the balance. So indeed, we now have the balance property here. We also have the movements, and of course, it's gonna contain the minus 500, right? So that's the money that we just transferred away to Jessica Davis. And indeed, it should also already be in Jessica Davis. So her latest movement is now indeed 500. So let's check it out also in the user interface. Now, before doing that, the final thing that we're going to do is to clean these input fields. But now, just to make sure, let's log in as Jessica Davis, and then we should get plus 500 here as the latest deposit. All right. Now, as I was saying, we need to clean out these inputs now. And that we will do no matter if the transfer was successful or not. So we can do that outside of this if statement. So just down here. Or actually, we can do it right here. Let's get rid of this console.log. And then input transfer amount equal, or actually dot value equal input transfer to equal the empty string. And with this, we should be finished. Let's try it one more time. This time, Jessica Davis will transfer something. And so we lost here the latest transfer, of course, because the page was reloaded. And this data, of course, then gets lost. So when our page loads, the information about the accounts, so the account data, will always be exactly what we have here in our code. Okay, so that's the reason why that data, that 500 transfer, is no longer here. But that doesn't matter. So let's transfer to Stephen Williams here, 1000. And we get an error here, assignment to constant variable HTML button. So at line 167, and oh, one more time, I forgot the value here. That's a very stupid mistake, right? Let's try that again. Stephen Thomas Williams, I believe. And now it worked. So all of our statistics here were updated. And indeed, now this field, or both of the fields, are empty. And now as we go to this account, oh, apparently it does not exist. Yeah, it is Stephen Thomas Williams. Yeah. So now we get this 1,000 deposit here that we just did previously. All right, awesome. So our application is coming more and more to life here.